Chairman of the GST and Indirect Taxes Committee of the Governing Council of the ICAI, my friend CA Rajendra Kumar, the Vice Chairman CA Umesh Sharma, the Council Member from Delhi CA Ajay Ray, the Treasurer of the SRRC CA Sundarajan, the many senior officers of various state governments and the union government, my colleagues from the Tamil Nadu Treasury Department, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be the chief guest at this very innovative, first of its kind symposium. I guess it's a bit unfortunate that the GST Council meeting got called on short notice for Saturday, so that probably reduced the attendance here. But it's symptomatic of some issues I've been raising for over a year, that such council meetings don't happen as they should once every 3 months with enough advance notice, with enough lead time on the agenda and so forth. But I don't want to be a perma-critic, so let me maybe put some things in context. The first time I actually ran into anybody who worked on GST was right here in this hotel. It was called a different hotel at the time. It was managed by a different company, and the same CA Rajendra Kumar invited me to speak to some CFO conference or something, and I ran into a gentleman who was the CFO of the GSTN. And I remember talking to him, it was 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. Or maybe even earlier, maybe I wasn't even an MLA then, I don't remember. But we talked about some of the complexities of his job back then. I am not a secret critic of many aspects of the design or vision of the GST. I say that apolitically because its original design was done by the UPA regime and then the implementation by NDA regime. The notion of moving towards consumption taxes from manufacturing originating sites, one state, one vote, irrespective of the size or scale, in the context of the fact that many small states get between 60 and 90% of their budgets, or 99% of their budgets through devolution of taxes, most people would call that a skewed system, that the conflict of interest is built into the system. And we have seen that in practice. But it is the backbone of our taxation system now. Unfortunately, it is too large a part of our taxation revenues. As I've mentioned again and again, indirect taxes by nature are regressive. Poorer and middle class people end up spending a lot more of their income in taxable goods and services compared to very rich elite people. So, in fact, we should, in good conscience, be raising 60-65% of our total tax base out of annual tax revenues, out of progressive taxes where we can identify who has how much money, who makes how much money, and therefore change the slabs accordingly, as opposed to point of sale indirect taxes which are not discriminating enough and by design will affect the poorer and middle class more. But all those are at some level of, design, philosophy, approach, system. Today I want to talk a little bit about implementation. I went through many changes in my career and I ran into many interesting people. One of the highest paid traders I ever met at Wall Street had come from very humble beginnings. He had excelled at school, gone to the right school. In fact, he had also gone to MIT Sloan. He was an English citizen, British citizen. And he had broken a lot of molds to get to the job he had. A very unique job, discussion for another day. But he remembered what his father told him when he kind of cut off from the path and went off in a different direction. And he said, son, it's not the direction, the decisions that you make that are the most important things in your life. It's what you do to follow through till you get to success. And he had a spectacular career. He made tens of millions of dollars in a relatively few years and then retired and went on to do other things. Because he followed that principle. Whatever decision he took, he ensured that he did the best after taking that decision going down that path. In that sense, I would say we have many, many glaring weaknesses in the execution of the GST. And I'll just highlight 4 or 5. We have already talked about how the meetings don't happen when they're supposed to happen. They're supposed to happen once in 3 months. At least in the last 5 years, that's not true. Any decent meeting that has 32, 33 members who are supported by hundreds of staff, the agenda should have come out a week, 2 weeks ahead of time so people can get prepared to have intelligent debate. That doesn't happen. I got the second agenda for Saturday yesterday. My best guess is I'll get a third and a fourth agenda between now and Friday night for a Saturday morning meeting. But there are some quantitative problems as well. As best I can tell, nobody in this country can explain how the IGST revenues are shared between the states. You remember that the first 2 years, the money was not split at all. About 89,000 crores or something was just held. And then only after the CAG pointed it out, then there was some retrofitting and the splitting of these funds. I have worked with our commercial tax department for a year and a half now. I can't figure out any methodology that will arrive at this outcome. And what's surprising to me is, very often the states have a view of how much is due to them in terms of GST payments from the union. And almost always the union government's reply in parliament or in the political debate will be some much smaller number. So how can both be true? If you add up all the states' claims, let's say it comes out to, 60,000 crores. Union government, the parliament, the minister will say, no, we only have about 8,000 crores backlog. They're both true. They're both true because the union government only recognizes the due after the CAG signs the report and submits it to them for that year's settlements. And there are 2 years worth of settlements still not approved by the CAG's office. So union government only talks about what it knows. We are still waiting because we think we have this number. We think the CAG report is yet ready, but it's not yet actually signed and delivered to the union government. So now I ask the question, if even the settlement coming out of GSTN and audit takes 2 years, how is it possible that the IGST settlements are happening on a monthly basis with maybe 2-3 month lag at most? So this black box system leads to lack of, respect, lack of trust, lack of buy-in, because nobody quite knows how the system works. And we get all these numbers, we're supposed to assume they're handed down from God because there's no rationale where I can recreate those numbers applying the logic. The same way, the way the fitment committees, the law committees, etc. are designed. I asked a question at one meeting, I don't want to embarrass people by naming names. There was some acute debate going on, and so I asked the question, who's on the fitment committee? Nobody knew. They had to send for the record from North Block to tell us which states were on the fitment committee. Who's on the law committee? Same situation. One particular state, I asked the officer, are you on the fitment committee? He said, no, I'm not. And then when the names came back from North Block, that state was listed. How is it possible that the officer doesn't know he's on the fitment committee, the union government thinks he's on the fitment committee through the GST secretariat? So there are many, many limitations in the execution. And these are not, one-sided views. This will come from many ministers and many officers in many states, irrespective of political leaning, because there are factual points. I'm not making this stuff up. To the credit of the Union Finance Minister and the officers in North Block, they realized this, so we have all these GOMs or subcommittees that work on them. And I must say that in my experience, the GOMs work much more efficiently and with direction and with reasonable outcomes compared to the full council of all states and the union, and we go back and forth and it's very hard. So the GST council in its entirety has become more of a rubber stamp because the bulk of the work gets done either the fitment committee or the law committee or the GOMs. The GOMs I have no problem with because they're elected officials, and in a democracy, the input of the people comes through the elected officials. The fitment committee and the law committee I'm not so confident about in terms of the constitutional standing where such decisions can be taken by a subset of officers of a subset of states of the Union of India. And then they get brought up in bulk, 100, 200, 80, 60 decisions for ratification by a large council with 1 day's notice or 2 days' notice. So these are some execution implementation limitations that I think are easily fixable. But the problem persists in other ways. So, for example, I'm now a member, or I had been for a year and a half, a member of a GOM on reforms. It's a standing GOM, unlike other GOMs that are given a time frame. Of course, they almost always extend the time frame, but they begin with some purpose and have an end date. The standing GOM has no such date. It's supposed to keep on proposing reforms. The problem with that is that the GOM has only met twice virtually, and both were abbreviated meetings, despite many members of the GOM across all parties requesting that we should have a 2-day in-person meeting, ideally at a place where a lot of analysts from GSTN could work with us and explain all the lacunae that we were observing, how were they arising, how they could be fixed, what could be systemic improvements, etc. So, in fact, those 2 meetings happened, and then politics gets in the way. What happened to me in the committee on, or the GOM on horse racing casinos and gambling, online gaming, same thing happened to me on the reforms, because somewhere along the way, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months into the life of the GOM, the convener, not just a member, the convener of the GOM lost their role in their government, either because the government was toppled or the cabinet changed. Therefore, they were no longer a member of the GST Council. Therefore, they were no longer on the GOM. Therefore, the GOM had no convener to call a meeting. 6 months, 8 months, 1 year, 15 months go by without a convener. And this logic, which is a later logic, and I've raised this publicly, I'm not saying anything here I've not said outside, so don't take this as a kind of private criticism. When these GOMs are convened, it used to be, at least in the time of Mr. Jaitley, that whichever state had the greatest interest or the exact priority based on the nature of the topic would be asked to be the convener. So, for example, on the gold shipment, the Finance Minister of Kerala was the convener. But ever since I've been there, there's this kind of added prioritizing based on seniority of role. I don't want to use the abbreviation that comes to mind or the adjective that comes to mind. So effectively they say, if a GOM has a CM as a member of it, he must be the convener or she must be the convener. If a GOM has no Chief Minister but Deputy Chief Minister as a member, then he or she must be the convener, and so on and so on. But in fact, that is exactly the opposite of efficiency. The odds that a minister can convene a GOM are much higher than the odds that a chief minister, in the midst of all their duties, running large states with tens or hundreds of millions of people, will be able to take the time to convene a GOM on a subset of issues in indirect taxation, which is going to affect the whole world or the whole country, right? So a lot of these practices seem to be driven by some strange sense of hierarchy or seniority or kind of methodology. and in fact, we are not getting the output or the progress that we should make. So I encapsulate all of this by saying only two things. One, as I've said before, I'll say again. If it were up to me and I were to compare this to any corporate entity or global professional standard that I have ever encountered in my career, I would hire 100 people full time: lawyers, accountants, tax specialists, analysts, system integrators, and put them to work for a year just doing systemic improvements, bringing transparency, bringing greater accountability, greater reliability, greater repeatability into the system. That's how much work I think the system needs. And that's just on less than 2 years membership in the council. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but since that's not happening, now I'll say on the flip side, therefore I think such symposiums, such gatherings of professionals and people who are at the coalface, who are actually running these systems, who are going through the mechanics, who are ensuring fairness, who are cutting down leakages and abuse. This is a vital venue and a vital gathering. And much as my association with the ICAI has been long and enriching, hopefully mutually, I would say that of all the places that I have spoken, and probably, 8 or 10 times at ICAI events in the last 4 or 5 years, or maybe a little bit longer, last 10 years, I would say this is the most crucial in my mind. Memorial lectures and annual conferences and all that are important. They're important in many ways. But something like the GST, which is so essential, it is, it generates half the revenues of our country's overall tax base or tax revenues, and in many states is a huge component of their revenue, especially the poorer states where direct taxes don't get devolved fast enough now. Then that system needs a lot of improvement and needs a lot of attention. And this is objectively. I can quantify, I can cite instances, I can show reasons why this needs to happen. And so in that sense, I'm glad you're all here. I know you will find it very productive to interact with each other, to cross-reference best practices, talk about common woes, talk about things that you can convey to us, your ministers or your other officers who attend the officers meeting or the GST Council or the GOM, where we can make improvements and we can start to see better outcomes that help the country and make all your roles more fulfilling and productive. So let me thank you again for inviting me and wish you a very productive 2 days. Thank you very much.